Hello and welcome to this edition of People, Politics and Power. I am Imonia Marere. On June 26, 1945, in the aftermath of the Second World War, 51 countries came together to sign the United Nations Charter. The Charter committed to maintaining international peace and security, developing friendly relations among nations, promoting social progress, better living standards, and protecting human rights. Unfortunately, 77 years after the world, that charter was signed, the world is plagued by insecurity, wars and conflicts, political instability, a mad and frightening arms race, poor governance, and food insecurity. The latest report of the Global Peace Index, published by the Institute for Economics and Peace, says the average level of global peacefulness declined to its lowest in 15 years in 2021, fueled by post-COVID economic uncertainty and the Ukraine conflict. The report covers 99.7% of world population using 23 qualitative and quantitative indicators, which are grouped into three main domains of ongoing conflicts, safety and security, and then, of course, militarization. The interpretation of this is that the world is less peaceful than it was when the UN Charter was signed 77 years ago. It is said that administrative and budgetary constraints limit the UN's capacity to respond to every serious threat to peace. In addition, UN peacekeeping has in several cases failed to prevent war or armed conflicts. There are many tragic cases where the population had to suffer due to failed missions in conflict zones. A clear indication of the inability of the UN to really stamp its feet in quickly responding to conflict situations, especially when it involves one or more of the world powers. Well, they call them the superpowers. Some analysts say the United Nations is limited since it does not have the attributes of sovereignty and depends on collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to peace by its member states. The political terror scare, political insecurity, neighboring country relations, refugees and internally displaced persons, IDPs, have reached their worst score in 16 years. The rising cost has increased food insecurity and political instability globally, with Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East under the greatest threats. The global economic impact of violence is put at $16.5 trillion, that is as of 2021, which is equivalent to 10.9% of global gross domestic product or GDP, or $2,117 per person. Sub-Saharan Africa recorded a 1% deterioration during this period, and South Sudan remains the least peaceful country in the region, despite an overall improvement. From the report, it appears that the UN's duty in ensuring world peace seems to have been whittled down and its influence not far-reaching enough to ensure peace and stability in its member states. The big question, therefore, is how well has the United Nations fared in the maintenance of international peace and security? Join our team of analysts as they seek to critically evaluate if the goal of a more peaceful and a more united world is still a possibility. Right, time to meet our guests analysts who are right here in the studio with us. First, from my immediate left is Dr. Kenneth Okonkwo. Dr. Okonkwo He's a lawyer by training and a global affairs analyst. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, and thank you, viewers at home.
Also joining us is Dr. Adoyi Matthew Omale. Dr. Omale is an international affairs analyst and he teaches at the Base University here in the nation's capital, Abuja. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, and I'm happy to be here.
Also joining us is Ambassador Humphrey Ojako, a familiar face on this program. He's been here a number of times before. Ambassador Ojako was Nigeria's permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hopefully we'll also be joined online by Professor Olajide Olagunju, who is a lawyer, an arbitrator, and a professor of conflict resolution and peace building. Thank you so much for joining us. He's joining us from the United States of America. Thank you so much.
Thank you, man. Thank you, everybody.
Welcome.
Love you guys.
Right. So let me begin from this end, Dr. Okonkwo. How would you describe the status of global peace and international security today?
Well, the status can speak for itself. It is tattered, it is shattered, and it is unfortunate. In West Africa, for instance, more than 4 states have degenerated into dictatorship. In South Asia, you see how the threat of war between China and Taiwan is becoming increasingly imminent. In the Eurasia, you see how Russia has unilaterally moved into Ukraine to attack and decimate the innocent country, and all over the world. So this is the worst time to be in this world in terms of international peace and security. And it is the failure of United Nations. And this failure has always had its prospects from beginning, from the way the organization was formed, from the way some members were made to be more equal than others and made to be above the law. I want to tell you by assertion that most of the international problems we have in this world take its origin from the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, whom I always describe as being above the law. Let us admit that when United Nations was founded in 1945, Africa was under colonization. So obviously Africa as a continent was not even regarded as part of the entities to be considered. So today, that UN Charter has become anachronistic because Africa has become independent. And the composition of the Security Council, it goes against the Charter itself. In Article 23, paragraph 1, they said the members of the Security Council shall reflect equitable geographical distribution. So in a world where a whole continent is completely ruled out, having no veto power, it is a world where that continent is suffering most in terms of lack of international peace and security.
So, let me throw that to Ambassador Ojako, who, of course, will have a first-hand knowledge of the workings of the United Nations. When it was set up in 1945, 77 years ago, the goal was to create a better world, a more secure and a more peaceful world. But from what we see on a day-to-day basis and from the Global Peace Index, it appears that there is a deterioration. Can we trace that to the origins of the United Nations, to the charter setting it up, as Dr. Okonkwo has said?
Thank you for bringing me into the conversation, but I agree with Professor Okonkwo to a large extent. The United Nations, as we all know, was established after the Second World War to guarantee global peace and security. That's its main objective, which he has explained. So in that sense, if it is not living up to that bidding, we could say, yes, the United Nations is not fulfilling the role for which it was created. However, it will be stretching it a bit to suggest that the United Nations is the cause of the various conflicts and instabilities that are racking the world at the moment. It is nations, member countries, that make up the United Nations. It is what they decide that becomes international regulating principles and laws. If they created the 5 permanent members, it was for a purpose. The purpose was to ensure that powers who could disrupt things were the powers who were in charge of things, so that things would not be disrupted. You can argue that that decision was based on the principle of those who were powerful nuclear power countries and all of that, and they were supposed to be the guarantors of the peace. That may be a bit faulty, because if any of them turned rogue at any time, if any of them reneged or wielded the veto, the world was automatically incapacitated to do anything. And that is the point that Professor Okonkwo has made, which I agree with completely. However, the question of Africa, he also observed Africa came late into the business of United Nations politics and diplomacy, simply because most of the African countries were still colonies under the colonial masters. So now, yes, there is agitation for a permanent seat in the UN Security Council for an African country or two. But there is no guarantee that if they get that, when we get that, that will begin to ensure the peace and security of the world. No, simply because what drives security is the element of power. If you do not have the power, you cannot stop a powerful person trying to impose his will. He gave the example of what is happening between Russia and Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine because it could, and it knew that the United Nations was not equipped in any way to countermand the political will of a superpower who also controls a permanent seat and a veto power in the United Nations system. So that may be a fault of the UN. It may be corrected, but it still will not guarantee the peace. The only thing that can guarantee global peace and security is the common will of the international community to come together and say, no, no more wars. Anybody who starts it, all of us. That's the uniting for peace kind of thing, in which case nobody could veto that, but I don't see that happening, not anytime soon.
In fact, that's my point of departure, Dr. O'Malley. Yeah. From a scholar's perspective, can there be a time, at any time at all, that common will can be demonstrated?
Well, we have to look at the issues from a historical perspective. Historical in the sense that what happened during the League of Nations? The League of Nations existed. I have to give way to the formation of the United Nations. What were the weaknesses of the League of Nations, which necessitated the forming of the United Nations? The League of Nations was essentially weak because it failed to arrest the crisis that led to the Second World War. Appeasement failed. The forces that threw up the Second World War, the League of Nations could not prevent them from going into hostilities as at that time, because the League was weak. The League was weak due to a lot of factors which some of the panelists here have enumerated. One, lack of enforcement mechanism for the League's decision. That lack of enforcement mechanism for the League's decision is still plaguing the United Nations. The United Nations will pass resolutions upon resolutions upon resolutions. Don't forget that the United Nations does not have a standing force like a law enforcement organ where they will say, okay, if you refuse, you are arrested and jailed. The League of Nations suffered from that lacuna before, and we thought that with the coming of the United Nations, it was going to be resolved. During the League of Nations, one of the things that led to the failure of the League of Nations was the provision that countries can go to war as long as they are defending their national interest, their self-interest. When the United Nations came on board, say no, under no condition must you violate the territorial sovereignty of any nation. But up to today, there's no enforcement mechanism. Countries have been violating the sovereignty of countries without anybody calling them to question. Only in instances where America, who assume the position of the policeman of the world, it's only when they decide to write to say, no, we are not going to tolerate this. And then maybe they will serve as the enforcement organ of the United Nations decisions. When the Americans intervened in Iraq, we didn't see the United Nations moving as a collective body. Though we have collective security under the United Nations, the system of collective security, it has been largely seen that it's not effective. Apart from isolated cases of peacekeeping, the collective security system has not really led to stopping hostilities and stopping wars.
Well, Professor Olagunju, let's take it up from there and to ask this question. What exactly do you think, apart from the weaknesses that have been outlined in the UN Charter and in the UN as a body, what makes it possible for the escalation of conflicts and wars around the world today? Is it that the human nature has come to bear in the sense that more and more countries and more leaders around the world are becoming more war conscious? Or is it to say, for instance, that the procurement of arms, the arms race that we have seen in the last 77 years is, of course, very frightening and a very mad one at that? Is it that it bolsters the economy of certain countries, and that is why we are seeing more and more people and more countries resorting to arms?
Thank you very much. And thanks for the introduction to the Global Peace Index. It's a very useful reference. But to answer your question, first, we need to remember that we must not only see conflict negatively, we must also see it positively. And the more we have conflict, the more we need to understand what is this thing called conflict. Conflict is simply telling us we have a relationship. And the world is becoming more and more intertwined. And so we need to look at it from that perspective. Now, what is the other positive thing about conflict? Conflict in itself is not what is bad. It's our inability to realize that behind conflict is a thermometer. Conflict is telling us there are needs of mankind that are not being met. It could be big, it could be small. But every time the need of mankind, either as individuals or nations, are not met, there will be conflict. We need to start at that. Because otherwise we just demonize conflict and we get confused. Now, I think United Nations has tried its best within its limits. Men tend to be conservative, so I can understand why change to the United Nations structure is taking time. But the thing is, what is responsible and what must we do? I think that what is responsible is failure of leadership at three levels: global, local, and individual. No matter how unimportant you think you are as an individual, you are very important. As a matter of fact, recent thinking on conflict management and conflict resolution and conflict management says that we have the multi-track diplomacy, where you have government, you have business, you have academia, you have the private citizen, very important private citizen, individual, NGOs helping with conflict resolution, activists, religious organizations, funding agencies, media. That is why you brought us money. You are managing global and local conflict, and you've been doing that for many years, and I celebrate you for that. So to begin with that, every one of those sectors I mentioned, as you are doing your own here in the media, the other people need to know that they have responsibility. They have responsibility. Secondly, on the global leadership level, at the global leadership level, we need to know that three things must happen. There must be mutual respect. There's no nation that's more important than the other. We talk of big nations, and it appears so, but the truth is that every nation is important. So there must be mutual respect. Secondly, there must be equitable trade. If you go back to the global index, you see they talk about socio-economic structures. Now, if you kill a nation's economy through inequitable global trade, you are bringing conflict. So global political diplomatic leadership needs to promote equitable trade. And of course, genuine brother's keeper. You have to be your genuinely each other's brother's keeper as global leaders, as diplomatic leaders. Now, what does that entail? It means we have to remember that peace is not possible anywhere except it is built everywhere. And 9/11 is a pointer to that. It was a very bitter thing for me because in June 2011, I was in the US at the invitation of the US government. And everywhere I went, I said, what was going on was wrong. They abandoned the peace process. That was the Bush administration, abandoned the peace process. And I said, this is not hell. Of course, I couldn't have known 9/11 was coming. And then 3 months later, you had the 9/11. What was the problem? The US, as at June 2011, was very peaceful. I mean, I could feel, I'm an expert in conflict and all that. There was palpable peace in the US. And it was built around what I told you about multi-track diplomacy. Every community you went in the US, you see everybody, media, education, academia, everybody pulling their weight, helping everybody in the community. So there was peace. This communal peace led to national peace in the US. Now, but what was the problem? There was peace in the USA, but there was no peace elsewhere. And the US at that point had abandoned Clinton's strategies about building peace, about intervening in the Middle East. And so they were attacked. Because if you don't build peace everywhere, you cannot really be at peace. The second one is local political leadership. And that is in three phases.
Okay,
Number one,
Professor Elijah,
strong economy, most important.
We'll come back to the economic factor much later. But I just want Dr. Okonkwo to respond to some of the issues that we have thrown up. The issues about failure of leadership as being responsible for conflicts and wars across the world. We are having more and more of conflicts and more of wars, not just in Africa, in Asia, even in Europe.
Yes. Well, it goes back to what I said. There is nothing a leader can do beyond the laws available to execute. Because you and I know that executives execute the law. United Nations, like I said before, is built on the offense of the basic natural justice. You cannot be a judge in your own cause. And Article 27, paragraph 3 made it clear that decisions of the Security Council shall be done by the affirmative vote of 9 members with the concurring votes of the 5 permanent members, provided that any party to the dispute will not be a party to the vote. But look at, for instance, in the case of Russia and Ukraine, when it comes to the Security Council, Russia is still allowed to vote. And then
to exercise veto power.
Veto power. And then with that veto power, everything you talk against Ukraine is of no water. So there is nothing leadership can do if you do not even have the laws and if you're not even willing to obey the laws. So basically, the leadership must rise. If you offend natural justice, there is no way you can implement social justice. As I told you before, Africa has been the battleground from the day of colonization. Remember the Cold War? Cold War was between America and Russia, but it was in Africa that was the battleground. Remember Angola? Remember, where they were fighting for capitalism and socialism. and Africa was the battleground. Why? There was no African country that could veto whatever any other country will bring in the Security Council. Meanwhile, the United Nations ceded the authority to maintain peace in the whole world to 15 members. Article 24 is very clear. He said it is agreed. Meaning, if you're a country and you're not part of the Security Council, you're not even around what is happening to even make an input as to international maintenance of peace and security. Because he said it is agreed that the whole world has ceded its power of security to the Security Council only. Now, the danger here is this. You're not a permanent member. You're not a member of the Security Council. Who will speak for you? And Africa continually comes under that. International cooperation is based on give and take. Why is Syria and Assad surviving today? Because it has the backing of one security member and is willing to do whatever Russia says in order to stay in power. In Africa, what are they giving? If nothing, there is nothing they can take. In the whole world, remember what happened to Muammar Gaddafi? Immediately the 5 members agreed, he was gone. So principally, the failure of leadership is based on the failure of the charter not providing to make sure that its purposes are all executed. In Africa, if Africa had a veto power, it's a case of give and take. If France wants to do something, what are you going to do for Africa? If you don't do it, we will veto it. And France will negotiate. UK will negotiate. That is the whole thing about international cooperation. So what we are saying is that the whole United Nations Charter should have to be re-examined. And if not, United Nations will fail like the League of Nations, because you cannot exercise powers beyond what you are given. 15 members are too small to decide what is going on in the world. And veto power is completely undemocratic. Now, let me tell you where United Nations told a lie to itself. In Article 2, Paragraph 1, it said United Nations is built on the principle of sovereign equality of all nations. Well, that is the animal farm kind of equality. Animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And those that are more
power
equal
makes them much more powerful than other members.
And they are above the law.
Ambassador, there are those who have suggested over time, and this has been almost like a campaign, that there's a need to restructure United Nations. There's a need to restructure the administrative system of the United Nations. The advocates of these seem to believe that if that happens, then we may have a more functional United Nations. Is it as simple as that?
Well, again, I appreciate both Professor Konko and the gentleman who spoke from
Professor
the United States.
Yes.
Yes, Professor Olagunju. They've approached this thing from different perspectives, but they're all leading to the same thing. And my colleague here, who
Dr.
is
Mali.
sitting here, exactly, Tomado, again captured it in that lack of enforcement mechanism. Professor Olagunju was talking about conflict. Conflict is not the same, it's not coterminous with war. In every human organization, there must be conflict. So that you can control and manage. But the failure of diplomacy, which probably is what we are calling the failure of leadership, because I don't know if there's anybody appointed world leader who would say, I am the captain of the world, what I say happens. Probably that's the reason they also thought of Security Council with 15 members, 5 with veto power. This veto power thing needs to be re-examined, as he said. But there is something nobody can run away from. In the case he explained about Africa, if France has an issue it wants to execute in Africa, and an African veto country, let's say Nigeria, assuming Nigeria had the veto, and Nigeria vetoed it at the United Nations Security Council, yes, it becomes an illegal thing for France to do. But supposing France decides to go ahead and do it anyway, who is going to stop him? That is the dilemma of this whole thing about world leadership and managing peace and security and stability. That is one. Then the United Nations, we must remember, cannot stop conflicts happening. In fact, it's not its remit. Its remit is violent wars, you know, things that breach the security of the world. That's what it should get involved with. Now, the Treaty of Westphalia, which recognized the existence of nations, is built on what we call national interest. National interest is defined, is protection, the capacity, the ability, the extent you're able to defend your national interest is the capacity you have, the both kinetic, economic, and other powers to do so. If you do not have that, there are those academicians who argue about a moral world. But the fact on the ground, which you see every day in these international meetings and conferences, is that, yes, as Professor Konko quoted,
Doctor.
you know, the UN Charter talks about the equality of all nations, you know. But you and I know that in reality, in the real life, in the real world out there, yes, some countries are more equal than others. Is there a mechanism to change that in the world? Is there a way to make all countries so powerful that if, for instance, what was happening in Ukraine was between Ukraine and, say, some other country in former Eastern Europe, listen, it would have been over since. Because the world will now feel emboldened to say, no, this is what, but because, as he noted, a superpower, if you want to recognize Russia as that, which it is, because with the alliance you have seen from NATO and the assistance Ukraine has received in the past 3 months, Russia is still standing. That's what this is about. It's a function of power. Until there is that will to say, let us all agree that once the United Nations has passed a judgment, every nation in the world, big or small, must rally around that decision and implement it. So even if it is one superpower who can challenge the whole world, and there are, you know there are, yet it will be at a huge disadvantage. But the lessons of Ukraine show you that even at that, when the United Nations tried to do a Uniting for Peace resolution, many countries took the other side. Many countries decided to abstain, especially African countries. Again, it's a consideration of your national interest and power. Many of them depend on Russia for basic things like energy. Even you could see European countries that are a bit stronger. Some are beginning to vacillate because of their total reliance on Russia for its energy needs. Even a powerful country like Germany, even though it is a NATO country and so on, the Germany and France are talking of giving Putin something so that he doesn't lose face, so that we can find a handle to stop this matter. So my thinking as a practitioner in diplomacy, especially multilateral diplomacy for 35 years, what I tell people is the theory, the morality is good, it's important, we must uphold them, but always keep your eyes on the power structures of the world. You dismiss it, nothing works. Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Mali.
Yes.
In addition to what you are going to say, just looking back now, 77 years after, would the world have been different if the UN did not come into existence at the time it did?
Well, I will answer a question before I go to what I want to say. The UN, to be fair, has tried. It's not easy to maintain peace anywhere in the world, even in our homes. It's very, very difficult to maintain peace. So to that extent, the UN has tried. Like Kenneth said, within its limited resources and time. The most important thing is that a lot needs to be done. The UN is not reforming as quickly as it should. As at the time it was set up 77 years ago in 1945, the circumstances of the world has changed tremendously. Globalization has taken root. Colonialization has been abolished. The world has been reduced to a global village. A lot of issues has come up that needs the world to take a second look. What can we do to fit into the world of the 21st century? How do we reform the United Nations to make it more effective? What I wanted to say before is that as far back as some long time ago, scholars like Hans Morgenthau, the father of real politics, and that is what Ambassador has been saying, it's about power game. Most of the conflict you see in Africa, Southeast Asia, they are proxy wars. We are just pawns in the chess game, in the chessboard. Most of the conflict across Africa, you can trace its origin either from one of the superpowers or the other. France is riding roughshod in the whole Francophone speaking countries of Africa. Portugal is carrying out its own agenda in other places. The United Kingdom is having sway in some other countries. So most of the conflict in Africa, even if you go to Asia, most of the countries are still attributed to the unequal relationship. Scholars like Walter Rodney, though their scholarship has been said to be outdated, but what they said are still there. The periphery-center relationship, the unequal relationship. And this relationship will continue to be equal as long as we depend on these technologies. As long as we depend, we as Africans. I agree, it's a question of leadership domestically, but internationally it's not question of leadership, it's question of power, power play, relations, power relations between countries. And nobody will sacrifice their national interest unless we protect our national interest. Who are the ones supplying the arms? Who are the manufacturers of these arms? And when you look at it, it is still the people with veto power that are manufacturing the various weapons of mass destruction. And they are arming rebel groups, they are arming insurgent groups, they are arming all kinds of groups, all for their selfish economic interests. So realism is real. The struggle for power within the international system, even the Ukrainian-Russia conflict, it can be situated within power relations. The Russians are trying to keep them away, keep their boundaries safe by not allowing NATO to expand to Ukraine. So they are all they are fighting for is to make sure that the West do not penetrate. The West too is trying to get foothold in that region. So again, you see it's power play. If you go to Sudan, the crisis in Sudan took in a dimension in the Darfur region. Immediately oil was discovered. And oil politics becomes very, very pertinent in most of the conflict. It's either raw materials have been discovered in a particular place. Look at the Congo. Look at all the crises there. It centers around mining activities. Even in our own Nigeria, since the discovery of gold in Zamfara, Zamfara has not been the same again. A lot of banditry has come up, a lot of issues. So most of the conflict in the developing countries, you cannot extricate power and influence of the international community from them.
Okay, so that's where I bring in Professor Olagunju. Let's examine very quickly, let's examine the economic matrix side by side with the power relations has been put forward here by the panelists who are right here in the studio.
Yes, especially Dr. Mali. It was interesting. I was listening to him. He was talking about power play. I'm just wondering, where is he going? So I'm happy he ended in economics. The power play appears to me to be largely based on economics, wealth of nations. The France, Britain, and all the big powers, they are not fighting because they hate each other, but because they are looking at the wealth of nations, how much of it they can corner to themselves. And that is very important. And that's why I said that we must focus on equitable international economy. The situation whereby you have unequal economic relations, where some get more and some get less, where the richest nations in the world potentially is Congo, Nigeria, and all that, they are poor in reality. And their wealth, really, if you look at it, their net wealth flows to the big nations of the world. That is wrong and has to be corrected. Now, the thing is that we cannot just blame the big power brokers. It will be very unfair and wrong. It takes two to tango. What are we, as local political leaders, what are we doing? That's number one. Number two, what are we as individuals? I talk about the multi-track diplomacy. What are we as individuals? Now, the media is doing its own. What is the academia doing? What is the activists? What are they doing? So we have to look at this at holistic. If a nation, no matter how small it is, if it says stop, it will stop. The exploitation and the oppression will come. It takes collaboration between the leadership of a weak nation and leadership of a more powerful nation to exploit the situation and to have the conflict continue. So we must take responsibility at the three levels I told you about: the global leadership level, the local political leadership level, and the multi-track leadership level. Now, concretely, what must be done? At the local leadership level, our leaders must begin to see that your importance as a nation, as a political leader, is dependent on how people see your people. So if you think that you are a president or whatever you are, and you feel so important, but your people are left behind, there's so much poverty, which drives conflict. We must always remember that where the economy is bad, expect conflict. I mean, the index, the global index you shared with us, shows that. But when a country begins to pick up economically, you see that their peace increase. Why? An idle hand is the devil's workshop. So that's where I see the balance. I realize that power play comes in. There are some nations more powerful than the others. But I think that to look at the powerful nations and not look at what the so-called weaker nations are doing will be wrong. It's a balance. And that's what...
thank you so much, Professor Olagunju.
Two ends of the rope.
Thank you so much.
What are they doing? But what am I doing to improve and change things? I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Dr. Okonkwo, let's begin to look at solutions now, very quickly. What needs to be done? Nigeria, for instance, is ranked 143 out of the 165 nations that were surveyed in the Peace Index. That although there has been an improvement of, say, about 3 or 4 steps from 2020, yet the 2021 index clearly shows that we are a nation not at peace with ourselves. Now, beginning from the local level to move into the global stage, what do we need to do?
First of all, the first solution that we would have to have in mind is to admit as to the inevitability of conflict. As a matter of fact, after the fall of man in the Garden of Eden, God himself was not interested that the whole world will agree to one thing. And the reason why God was not interested was that if you only need to capture that man who is in charge of the whole world, if the whole world has come under one leadership in order to derail the whole world. That was what happened at the Tower of Babel. So there is no time in the whole world that the whole world will agree on an issue. Take it as given, because that is what will inform your entering into solutions. And like you said, let each and every citizen of the world be the example you want to see. Starting from the individual person. What are you contributing to the peace of the world? Well, artists like us, we are ambassadors of peace. Even by August, they will still give me another United Nations SDG, Ambassador of Peace. And part of the things we are trying to do now is to campaign that if we continue to jaw, we will not war. Everything can be sorted out on the table. Article 2, paragraphs 3, 4 of the United Nations is very clear. It said every member should refrain from the threat or use of force against the political independence and territorial integrity of any state. And he said every dispute should be resolved by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace, security, and justice are not endangered. Now, the United Nations must live up to the true meaning of its charter. Every nation shall be sovereignly equal to every other nation. And that is graduating the United Nations from the superpower mentality of some members that are placed above the law to democratizing the Security Council by making every vote of the United Nations members to count.
And equal.
If within the national sphere, no matter how powerful you are as a human being, your vote is equal to the vote of the poorest person, then we must admit that on the international sphere, for peace to prevail, the vote of Togo must be equal to the vote of United States. Recall that the president of Togo, as he then was, said, whether you are the president of United States or you are the president of Togo, a president is a president.
Ambassador Jacko, will that come to fruition anytime soon? What are your projections?
I'm thoroughly impressed with Dr. Konko's
Thank you, sir.
ideas. But, you know, it is good to think that we can have a Togo whose weight in the United Nations is as strong, powerful, and equal as say that of the United States. It sounds so beautiful to me because I come from here. Relative to the United States, Nigeria is a weak country. So coming from here, I would definitely love that. But how do you think an American or a Chinese would want to love that too? That's where that gospel comes in and it becomes a moral. However, at the local level, that's at the national level, because all peace must start from the locality. That is totally indisputable. Now, leadership comes in at the municipal level. That's the national level. If you do not create an environment, if you do not establish structures and institutions that ensure justice, ensure equity, equity in those economic things you are talking about. Who gets what, when, and how? The prof will know much better about that. Fairness. Once those things are not seen to be the bastion of governance in any society, please expect conflict. And if conflict comes, you do not have that leadership capacity to manage it, like managing the diversity of your country well. You are looking for a violent conflict, in which case you'll be looking for international assistance to come and help you do this and that. And when they come, that's one thing we must understand in this past. When they come, they're not coming because they love you. No. This is an assumption we make here. Oh, the UN will come, America will come. Nobody comes because they love you. They come because they have an interest to protect or to advance.
Dr. O'Malley,
yes,
60 seconds.
Solutions are everywhere there. We cannot go it alone as Africans.
Sure.
That is why we have the African Union. As we are criticizing the United Nations, what of our old African Union? Sure. What of our own sub-regional bodies like ECOWAS? A lot is going wrong there.
What of even the Commonwealth?
Yes,
that just ended a summit.
They are multilateral organizations. And we have to make sure that they run effectively to be able to have a collective voice. If the whole of Africa can aggregate all their interests together and pursue it at the higher United Nations level, Africa will achieve a lot. Secondly, when we talk about solution, we are not, the Security Council is just one organ of the United Nations. Look at the International Court of Justice at The Hague. 5 judges are permanently there at every point in time from these countries. So how do you get justice in the Hague when all the 5 permanent members are permanent judges at every point in time at The Hague? So even if you go there, they are still waiting for you at the end.
All right.
So the reforms should be wholesale.
Yeah.
From the World Health Organization, from the World Trade Organization,
to all the organs of the
yes,
of the UN.
The Security Council is just one. That is just the point.
Thank you so much. Well, what I gather from all that you have been saying is very simple. That peace begins in the hearts of men.
Yes.
And it is from there that it can be built into a larger base. And that's the message that we need to send out here. We must begin to build peace in our hearts and take it to the smaller community and then, of course, to the larger society. I want to thank you immensely for finding time to join us on this program today. Ambassador Humphrey Ojako, former permanent representative of Nigeria to the United Nations in Geneva. Thank you so much for honoring us at such a short notice. Dr. Adoyi Matthew Omale is an international affairs analyst and he teaches at the Bayes University here in the nation's capital, Abuja. Thank you so much. And of course, Dr. Kenneth Okonkwo is a lawyer and a global affairs analyst. Thank you so much for finding time to join us. And Professor Olajide Olagunju, he joined us virtually from the United States. He's a lawyer, he's an arbitrator, and a professor of conflict resolution and peace building. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Moni.
All right. For you, our viewers out there, we want to thank you for investing your time with us, and we hope that you have gotten the message. Build peace in your hearts, and then, of course, export it to the community. Bye for now. We'll see you again. Bring you a fresh edition of the program.